The year is 1796. In the dense, shadow-choked forests of Wythe County, Virginia, a cold autumn mist clings to the ground like a shroud. It's a land still raw, still untamed, where the lofty ideals of a new nation feel distant and fragile. Here, civilization is a flickering candle in an ocean of darkness, and the courthouse stands as its most potent symbol, a bastion of order against the chaos of the frontier. But on a particular morning in late October, that symbol would be desecrated. The silence that fell over the town of Evancham was not the peaceful quiet of a rural morning. It was a heavy, suffocating silence, the kind that follows a moment of profound and unspeakable violence. The doors of the log-hewn courthouse were sealed, not by law, but by a thick, dark substance that had seeped through the cracks in the wood. It was the color of rust and smelled of the slaughterhouse. No one dared approach. The town constable, a man hardened by years of frontier justice, stood frozen 50 feet away, his face a pale mask of terror. He had seen death in every conceivable form in skirmishes, duels, and disease, but he had never witnessed an aura of dread so palpable, so complete. It was as if the building itself had been poisoned, transformed into a tomb overnight. What lay inside was not just a crime scene. It was an anomaly, a bloody tear in the fabric of reality that would be violently stitched shut, its memory banned from the annals of American history. This is the story of a massacre they tried to erase, a cold case so horrifying, its echoes still haunt the Virginia hills. The man tasked with breaking that dreadful silence was Judge Spencer Roane. A respected jurist, a man of logic and law, his name was synonymous with the burgeoning legal system of the United States. He arrived on horseback, his face grim, summoned by a frantic, barely coherent messenger. As he dismounted, the metallic, cloying scent of blood hit him, even from a distance. The assembled townsfolk parted for him, their faces a mixture of fear and morbid curiosity. They looked to him for answers, for a return to normalcy, but what he was about to discover would offer none. With a heavy axe, the constable finally splintered the courthouse door. The sound of cracking wood echoed unnaturally in the dead air. As the door swung inward, a collective gasp rippled through the crowd. But it was not a scream. It was the sound of breath stolen, of minds struggling to process a sight that defied all reason. Judge Roane stepped across the threshold, his boots sticking to the gore-soaked floorboards. The scene within was not one of chaos, but of grotesque, ritualistic stillness. Every soul who had been present for the land dispute hearing of Paris v. Cole was dead. The judge, the 12 jurors, the plaintiff, the defendant, their lawyers, and the bailiff, 22 bodies in total. They were not merely killed. They were arranged. Positioned in their seats as if the trial were still in session, their heads slumped forward, their hands folded neatly on the tables before them. The only sign of violence was a single, impossibly precise incision across each of their throats, a macabre smile from ear to ear. The room was a tableau of slaughter, a horrifying work of art. To understand the terror of that day, one must first understand the world of 1796 Virginia. This was not the genteel, plantation-filled landscape of the Tidewater. Wythe County was the frontier, a rugged, mountainous region carved out of a wilderness that still felt ancient and menacing. It was a place of deep-rooted superstitions, where the folklore of Scots-Irish settlers mingled with the far older, darker legends of the Cherokee and Shawnee who had been forcibly displaced. Here, tales of haints and monstrous creatures lurking in the fog-filled hollers were not just children's stories. They were whispered warnings shared between homesteads. The people were tough, self-reliant, and deeply suspicious of outsiders and overarching authority. They lived by their own codes, often preferring the swift justice of a feud over the slow, methodical process of the law. The courthouse in Evancham was, for many, an unwelcome intrusion, a symbol of a distant government imposing its will. It represented a new order, one that sought to tame the land and its people with statutes and property deeds, overriding the unwritten laws that had governed these hills for generations. This tension, this friction between the old ways and the new, simmered just beneath the surface of daily life. And it was within this crucible of fear, superstition, and resentment that the horrifying events of the Courthouse massacre would unfold, feeding a local terror that the official record would later try and fail to completely extinguish. It was a forbidden place long before the blood was ever spilled. As Judge Roan stood amidst the silent, perfectly staged carnage, his legal mind reeled. This was not the work of a frenzied mob or a lone madman. The precision was chilling, surgical. Every victim was seated upright, their posture corrected post-mortem. The plaintiff, Jedediah Parris, and the defendant, Silas Cole, sat at their respective tables, their dead eyes staring blankly at the judge's empty bench. The 12 jurors were arranged in the jury box, a silent congregation of the damned. Even the court clerk, a young man named Elias Vance, was slumped over his ledger, a quill pen still clutched in his stiffening fingers. The most disturbing detail, however, was the complete lack of any struggle. Not a single chair was overturned. Not a single inkwell was spilled, save for the one that now dripped a crimson stain onto the floor. The room was pristine except for the blood. It was everywhere, yet contained. It soaked the victims' collars and pooled on the tables before them, but there were no spatters on the walls, no bloody footprints leading in or out. It was as if the violence had been conjured from thin air, enacted upon its victims as they sat placidly, unaware. How could 22 people be slaughtered without a single one raising a hand in defense? How could such a bloodbath occur with no signs of a fight? The questions multiplied, each more unsettling than the last, creating a mystery that seemed less like a crime and more like a curse. The most baffling element, the one that would elevate this crime from a simple massacre to a horrifying, impossible mystery, was discovered by the constable. After his initial inspection of the bodies, he moved to check the building's perimeter. He found every window shuttered and barred from the inside. The rear door, the only other exit, was also bolted shut, with a heavy oak beam reinforcing it from within. There was no secret passage, no trapdoor in the floorboards. The chimney flue was too narrow for a child to climb, let alone a killer, or killers, capable of overpowering 22 people. The log-hewn courthouse had been transformed into a hermetically sealed container of death. There was no conceivable way for the perpetrator to have escaped. This single, terrifying fact shattered every logical explanation. It was a classic locked room mystery, but on a scale that was utterly unprecedented and macabre. Judge Roan, a man who built his life on evidence and reason, was confronted with an event that seemed to defy the very laws of physics. The killer, or killers, had vanished from a sealed room, leaving behind a gallery of corpses as their only testament. The whispers began almost immediately among the townsfolk huddled outside. This wasn't the work of man. This was witchcraft. This was the devil himself, summoned to hold a court of his own. The seeds of a forbidden legend were being sown, watered by the blood of the innocent, in the cursed soil of Wythe County. In the days that followed, a smothering blanket of fear descended upon Evanchem. The bodies were removed under the cover of darkness, buried in a mass, unmarked grave on the outskirts of town, the first act in a long and deliberate cover-up. Judge Roan, under immense pressure from the state capitol in Richmond, began a discreet and desperate investigation. He was a man adrift in a sea of impossibilities. He interviewed the families of the victims, hoping to uncover a motive, a connection, a thread of logic that could lead him to the truth. The case itself, Parris v. Cole, had been a mundane affair, a bitter dispute over a few dozen acres of rocky, undesirable land near the edge of a vast, unexplored tract of forest known locally as the Whispering Hollow. Both Jedediah Parris and Silas Cole were stubborn, cantankerous farmers, but neither was known for the kind of violence that could explain this. Roan delved into their histories, their finances, their secret allegiances. He found nothing. He questioned the jurors' families. They were simple men, blacksmiths, tanners, merchants, with no shared enemies or dark secrets that could link their fates together in such a horrifying way. The investigation was a series of dead ends. Every path Roan took led him back to the same impossible conclusion. The courthouse had become a tomb, sealed from within, and its occupants had been executed by a phantom. The official narrative was crumbling before it was even written. The truth, Rohn began to suspect, was not something that could be presented in a court of law. It was something far older and more disturbing. As Judge Rohn's official inquiry stalled, a second, more insidious investigation was taking place in the taverns and cabins of Wythe County. It was an investigation built on whispers, rumors, and half-forgotten folklore. The elders spoke of the land itself, the disputed territory of the Whispering Hollow. They said it was cursed ground, a place where the veil between worlds was thin. For generations, it had been a place to be avoided, especially after dusk. They shared tales of settlers who had ventured into its depths, only to return weeks later, their minds shattered, muttering about stick men who walked between the trees and a hollow judge who held court in the shadows. These were stories meant to scare children, but in the wake of the massacre, they took on a terrifying new significance. The land that Paris and Cole had been fighting over was not merely dirt and rock. It was the heart of this forbidden territory. Had their legal battle, their attempt to impose the laws of man onto this ancient, malevolent place, awakened something? Had they drawn the attention of the hollow judge? This narrative, born of superstition and fear, began to spread faster than any official report from Judge Rohn. It offered an explanation, albeit a horrifying one, for the impossible crime. It suggested that the force that had acted inside the courthouse was not from this world, and that its motive was not greed or revenge, but a chilling, territorial defense of its own dark domain. Desperate for a tangible lead, Judge Rohn ordered a second, more thorough examination of the courthouse. He hoped to find a hidden mechanism, a loose floorboard, anything to debunk the growing supernatural hysteria. He, along with the constable and two trusted deputies, spent an entire day inside the blood-scrubbed but still eerie building. They tapped every inch of the walls, pried at the floorboards, and dismantled the judge's bench. They found nothing. No secret doors, no hidden levers. The building was as simple and solid as it appeared, but as dusk began to fall, casting long, distorted shadows across the room, one of the deputies noticed something. Carved into the underside of the heavy oak table where the defendant, Silas Cole, had been sitting, was a peculiar symbol. It was not a letter or a number. It was a complex, geometric sigil, a spiral of intersecting lines that seemed to twist and writhe before the eye. It was etched into the wood with a precision that was unnerving, clearly not the result of idle whittling. The constable, a man of local stock, recoiled as if he'd been burned. He recognized the symbol. It was an old sign, a piece of forbidden Appalachian folk magic, a warding sigil. But it was a ward of a very specific and disturbing kind. It wasn't meant to keep evil out. It was meant to trap something in. The horrifying implication hung in the silent room. Silas Cole hadn't been a random victim. He knew what was coming, and he had tried and failed to contain it. The discovery of the sigil changed everything. It was the first piece of evidence that suggested one of the victims was not like the others. Silas Cole, the quiet farmer, was involved in something far deeper than a land dispute. Judge Rohn, a man of the Enlightenment who scoffed at such things, could no longer ignore the whispers of the occult. He ordered a search of Cole's remote, dilapidated cabin, located perilously close to the Whispering Hollow. What they found there was profoundly disturbing. The cabin was less a home and more a workshop for some unknown dark art. The walls were covered in the same spiraling sigil found in the courthouse. Strange bundles of sticks and animal bones tied with black sinew hung from the rafters, and on a small, crude table they found a collection of books. These were not the common farmer's almanacs or Bibles. They were hand-bound leather tomes, filled with dense, spidery script in a language that resembled a bastardized form of German or Dutch, interspersed with more of the disturbing geometric symbols. It was a library of the forbidden. Rohn couldn't read the text, but the illustrations were horrifically clear. They depicted ceremonies, summonings, and pacts with entities that were neither human nor animal. And on the final page of the most heavily used book, there was a detailed drawing of the Wythe County Courthouse, with the juror's box circled and a single, ominous phrase scrawled beneath it in English: the silent jury. Suddenly, the massacre was no longer a mystery about a vanished killer. It was a mystery about what the victims had been doing in that courthouse. It was not a trial of land. It was a ritual. The phrase, the silent jury, unlocked a new level of dread. It implied a horrifying purpose behind the staged, placid deaths of the 12 jurors. Judge Rohn, his investigation now veering into the territory of a macabre nightmare, sought out the oldest residents of the county, desperate for anyone who could shed light on these dark traditions. He found his answer in an elderly woman of mixed German and native heritage who lived as a hermit deep in the mountains. At first, she refused to speak, her eyes wide with a fear that was centuries old. But Rohn's desperation convinced her. With a trembling voice, she spoke of a forbidden legend, a piece of folklore so dark it was banned even from campfire tales. It was the story of the Schwede-Geschworenen, the silent jury. According to the legend, it was an occult ritual brought over by a reclusive sect of German pietists who settled in the mountains decades earlier. The ritual was a last resort, a desperate appeal to a powerful, non-human entity, a being they called the Magistrate of the Roots, or the Hollow Judge. The entity could be summoned to pass judgment when the laws of man had failed, but the price was steep. It required 12 souls to serve as a conduit, a silent jury whose bodies would host the entity's verdict. They would bear witness not with their eyes but with their lives. The ritual was said to be a perversion of a courtroom trial, a macabre mimicry of human justice. The woman's story painted a terrifying picture. The massacre was not a mass murder. It was a successful summoning. This revelation was so monstrous, so contrary to all rational thought, that Judge Rohn initially dismissed it as the ramblings of a senile woman. But the evidence from Silas Cole's cabin, the books, the sigils, the phrase, the silent jury, it all fit her story with terrifying precision. Rohn was forced to confront an unthinkable hypothesis. Silas Cole, believing he was being cheated out of his land by Jedediah Paris, had decided to appeal to a higher, darker court. He had enacted the ritual. The courthouse was the chosen vessel. The judge, the lawyers, and the bailiff were collateral damage, necessary components to complete the macabre parody of a trial. The 12 jurors, however, were the key. They had been consecrated unknowingly as the silent jury. Their purpose was not to deliberate, but to die, their collective life force offered up as payment to the summoned entity. The disturbing stillness of the crime scene suddenly made a horrifying kind of sense. There was no struggle because the victims were not attacked by a physical being. They were, according to the legend, simply unmade. The life was drained from them in an instant, a silent, supernatural execution. The single incision on their necks was not the cause of death. It was a mark, a seal of the pact, the signature of the hollow judge. Judge Rohn, a pillar of American jurisprudence, was now investigating a crime whose perpetrator was not a person, but a being from forbidden folklore. But if Silas Cole was the summoner, why was he also found among the dead? This contradiction gnawed at Judge Rohn. According to the old woman's tale, the summoner was supposed to be spared to receive the entity's favorable judgment. Cole's death suggested something had gone horribly wrong. Had he lost control of the entity he had summoned? Or was there another player involved, someone who had hijacked the ritual for their own purposes? Rohn's attention turned to the other party in the dispute, Jedediah Paris. Paris was by all accounts a more respectable man than Cole. He was a devout churchgoer, a family man, and wealthier than his rival. But there was a ruthlessness to him. He had acquired his land holdings through a series of aggressive, sometimes questionable legal maneuvers. Could Paris have known about Cole's occult dealings? Could he have discovered Cole's plan and decided to fight fire with fire? A second search was ordered, this time of Jedediah Paris's home. His farm was neat and orderly, a stark contrast to Cole's chaotic cabin. For hours the search yielded nothing but Bibles and farm ledgers. But then, hidden beneath a loose flagstone in his hearth, they found a small, locked iron box. Inside was a single folded piece of parchment. It was a letter dated just 2 days before the massacre. It was from Silas Cole. The letter was not a threat. It was a terrified plea. Cole begged Paris to abandon the lawsuit to give up his claim to the land in the Whispering Hollow. He wrote, "You do not know what you are trying to own. It already has a master. Let it be, or the silent jury will be called to session, and its judgment is binding on us all." This single document changed the narrative once again. Cole wasn't the aggressor. He was trying to prevent the ritual. The letter proved Silas Cole was not the monster. He was a man terrified of a power he understood all too well. It was Jedediah Paris, the seemingly pious victim who had been the catalyst. His relentless pursuit of the cursed land had pushed Cole to the brink. But the mystery remained. If Cole was trying to stop the ritual, who started it? And why was Paris, the intended beneficiary of a favorable legal outcome, also a victim? Judge Roan was trapped in a web of contradictions. It was then that he recalled a detail from his first walkthrough of the horrifying scene. The court clerk, Elias Vance, slumped over his ledger. In all the chaos and supernatural theorizing, the clerk had been overlooked, considered just another piece of collateral damage. Roan requested the ledger. It was a standard court record with dry, procedural notes about the case. But as Roan examined the last page, his blood ran cold. The final entry, written just moments before the massacre, was not in Vance's neat, practiced hand. The script was jagged, chaotic, written with a hand that must have been trembling violently. It was a single sentence. Judgment is rendered not for Paris, not for Cole, but for the court itself. The hollow judge presides now. The tithe is paid. Below the text was a crude, hasty drawing of the same spiraling sigil found under Cole's table. The clerk, Elias Vance, was not just a record keeper. He was a participant, and his final words suggested the ritual had a third, far more terrifying outcome than anyone could have imagined. If you find these forbidden histories as compelling as I do, take a moment to subscribe. What follows is a descent into a conspiracy so dark, it was meant to be buried forever. Elias Vance, the quiet, unassuming court clerk. In an instant, he became the new focus of the investigation. Who was this young man? He was an outsider, having arrived in Avanchem only a year prior. He was known for being diligent, quiet, and intensely private. He kept to himself, lodging in a small room above the town's general store. When Judge Roan and the constable searched his meager belongings, they found the missing piece of the puzzle. Hidden within the straw ticking of his mattress was a small, leather-bound journal. Its pages were filled with the same spidery script as the forbidden tomes in Silas Cole's cabin. Elias Vance was not just a clerk. He was a scholar of the occult, and a devotee of the entity known as the Hollow Judge. His journal revealed a horrifying plan. He belonged to the same reclusive sect as Cole's ancestors, a group that believed the burgeoning American legal system was a profane mockery of true justice. They believed that this new nation needed to be consecrated, its courthouses purged and reclaimed by older, more primordial powers. Vance had orchestrated the entire event. He had manipulated both Paris and Cole, subtly stoking their feud over the cursed land, knowing it would create the perfect conditions for the ritual. He had positioned himself as the court clerk to be at the very heart of the proceedings. The massacre wasn't about land. It was about sanctifying the courthouse with blood, turning it into the first American temple for the Hollow Judge. According to Vance's journal, the plan was monstrous in its ambition. He saw the Paris v. Cole case as a perfect sacrificial offering. Silas Cole, with his ancestral knowledge of the ritual, was an unwilling pawn. Jedediah Paris, with his greed, was the catalyst. Vance's journal detailed how he had secretly advised both men, feeding their paranoia and pushing them towards a confrontation he knew could only be resolved in the courthouse. He had even been the one to carve the warding sigil under Cole's table, not as a trap, but as an anchor, a focal point to concentrate the ritual's energy. His final journal entry, written the night before the massacre, was filled with a terrifying, ecstatic fervor. He wrote of the glorious consecration, of opening the door for the magistrate. He believed that by sacrificing the 22 souls within the courthouse, he would become the entity's chosen vicar, its first high priest in the new world. But his plan had a fatal flaw. He, like Cole, had underestimated the raw, untamable power of the entity he sought to worship. He believed he could control the ceremony, that he would be spared to witness his new god's ascension. He was wrong. The final, spidery entry in the court ledger was not a triumphant declaration. It was a record of his own terror as he realized the entity's judgment was absolute and indiscriminate. The hollow judge did not distinguish between petitioner, defendant, juror, or priest. It consumed them all. The tithe was paid in full. With this horrifying truth finally unearthed, Judge Spencer Roane was faced with an impossible choice. He now understood what had happened. A fanatical cultist had orchestrated a mass human sacrifice to a folkloric entity within a Virginia courthouse. How could he possibly report this? The very foundation of the young nation was built on the principles of reason, law, and order. An official account detailing a supernatural massacre and an occult conspiracy would shatter that foundation. It would cause mass hysteria, incite panic, and undermine the authority of the very legal system Roane had sworn to uphold. It would give credibility to the superstitions and dark beliefs that the new republic was desperately trying to leave behind. The governor in Richmond made the decision clear in a coded, private letter to Roane. The truth must be buried. The entire event was to be expunged from the record. It was too dangerous, too destabilizing. The official narrative would be that the courthouse had burned down in a tragic fire, and all souls within had perished. Any other explanation was banned. The town of Evancham would be given funds to rebuild, and the families of the victims would be compensated for their accidental loss on the condition of their absolute and permanent silence. An official history was being written, and the macabre truth of the massacre was its first casualty. The cover-up was swift and chillingly efficient. Official documents related to the Paris v. Cole case were gathered and burned. The surviving court records for Wythe County for the year 1796 show a mysterious gap, a silent autumn where no cases were heard. Elias Vance's journal and Silas Cole's forbidden books were personally destroyed by Judge Roane, their dark knowledge reduced to ash. The bodies in the mass grave were left unmarked, their names deliberately omitted from local church records. The courthouse itself, the site of the horror, was dismantled piece by piece, the blood-soaked logs hauled deep into the Whispering Hollow and burned on a massive pyre that lit up the night sky for miles. A new courthouse was built in a different location, and the original site was sown with salt, a symbolic act to prevent the evil from ever rising again. The townsfolk, silenced by a mixture of fear and government inducement, complied. They stopped speaking of the massacre. The story was driven underground, transforming from a public trauma into a private, forbidden ghost story, passed down only in hushed tones through generations. The state had successfully erased the event from history, but erasing a memory is not the same as killing a truth. And in the dark hollows of Appalachia, some truths have roots that run deeper than any grave. The hollow judge had been summoned, and a single ritual is not so easily undone. For decades the silence held. Wythe County grew, and the memory of the massacre faded into the mists of folklore. But the land did not forget. Strange occurrences continued to plague the area around the Whispering Hollow and the original courthouse site. Livestock would be found dead, not from predators but from a strange, bloodless affliction, their bodies left completely drained. Travelers reported seeing strange, flickering lights between the trees on moonless nights, and hearing the faint, chilling sound of a gavel striking wood echoing from the empty hollow. Children born in the generations after the massacre were sometimes afflicted with a disturbing night terror, waking up screaming about a man with a crooked smile, in a black robe who judged them from a bench made of bones. These incidents were dismissed as rural superstition, the overactive imaginations of an isolated people. But for those families who carried the secret of 1796, they were terrifying reminders. They were signs that the door that Elias Vance had opened had never been fully closed. The entity that had been offered a foothold in the world of men had not departed. It was waiting dormant, its influence seeping into the soil, poisoning the land and the minds of those who lived upon it. The curse of the courthouse had become the curse of the county. The most tangible evidence of this lingering presence emerged nearly 70 years later, during the American Civil War. A small Confederate encampment was established near the edge of the Whispering Hollow, not far from the original courthouse site. The soldiers, already hardened by the horrors of war, began to experience a profound and unsettling psychological decay. They complained of a constant feeling of being watched, of a pervasive sense of dread that leached their morale. Their letters home spoke of an unnatural silence in the woods, where not even insects seemed to make a sound. Several soldiers deserted, claiming they were being haunted by a silent jury of pale, gaunt figures who would appear at the edge of the firelight, their throats slit in a ghastly, smiling line. The commanding officer, a rational man, attributed these events to combat stress and poor rations. That is, until one morning he awoke to find his entire 12-man picket guard dead at their posts. They were sitting upright against the trees, their rifles resting on their laps. There were no signs of a struggle, no wounds from Union bullets. They were simply dead, a faint, dark line visible on their necks in the morning light. The camp was abandoned that very day, the official report citing an outbreak of a virulent fever. But the few survivors knew better. They had unwittingly set up camp on consecrated ground, and the hollow judge had held court once more. The legacy of 1796 did not just manifest as ghostly apparitions or unexplained deaths. It burrowed deeper into the very psychology of the region. A strange pattern began to emerge in the legal history of Wythe County in the 19th and early 20th centuries. The county became known for its unusually high number of hung juries. Time and time again, trials would end in stalemate, with jurors unable to reach a unanimous verdict, even in cases where the evidence seemed overwhelming. The phenomenon became so common it was dubbed the Wythe County stalemate by legal scholars of the era. Furthermore, there were numerous documented cases of jurors suddenly recanting their decisions, or suffering from intense psychological breaks during or after their service. They reported feeling an immense, inexplicable pressure in the deliberation room, a presence that clouded their judgment and filled them with a sense of utter futility. It was as if the very concept of human justice in that place had been permanently corrupted. The spectral, silent jury of 1796 had cast a long shadow, its supernatural verdict of deadlock and despair echoing through the decades, subtly undermining the rule of law from within the very institution it was meant to protect. This lingering corruption is a testament to the event's power, an event so macabre, it infected the future. If you feel that chill down your spine, it means you're paying attention. We're about to peel back one final, horrifying layer of this forbidden history. In the late 1920s, a young, ambitious folklorist from a northern university named Alastair Finch arrived in Wythe County. He had heard whispers of the stalemate phenomenon and believed it was rooted in some unique aspect of Appalachian folklore. He was unaware of the true, buried history of 1796. Finch spent months interviewing the locals, collecting stories and songs. He was met with a wall of silence whenever he asked about the old courthouse or the Whispering Hollow. The secret, though nearly 130 years old, was still kept with a palpable fear. However, Finch was persistent. He eventually gained the trust of a descendant of the constable who had first breached the courthouse door. The old man, on his deathbed, decided the story needed to be told, lest the truth be lost forever. He recounted the tale of the massacre, of the locked room, the silent victims, and the government cover-up. He also gave Finch a hidden artifact that his family had secretly preserved for generations, a single, splintered piece of wood from the original courthouse door, stained dark with the blood of the victims. Finch was stunned. He had stumbled upon not just a piece of folklore, but a major historical conspiracy and a horrifying cold case. He believed he had found the story that would make his career. He had no idea he had actually found his own doom. Alastair Finch returned to his university, his mind ablaze with the story of the courthouse massacre. He began to write, feverishly compiling his notes, corroborating what he could through the county's patchy historical records, and trying to make sense of the supernatural elements of the tale. He became obsessed, working late into the night in his office, the blood-stained piece of wood sitting on his desk, a dark paperweight holding down a mountain of forbidden history. His colleagues noted a change in him. He grew gaunt, paranoid, and reclusive. He complained of being watched, of seeing a tall, shadowy figure in his peripheral vision. He started talking in his sleep, muttering about a silent jury and a hollow judge. He was convinced that by unearthing the story, he had drawn the attention of the entity that had been dormant for so long. He wrote in his journal, "The story does not want to be told. It is not a memory, it is a living thing, and it is hunting me." His academic ambition had turned into a desperate race against time. To record the truth before his sanity, or his life, was claimed by the very history he sought to expose. The curse had found a new host, far from the Virginia hills, proving that its influence was not bound to the land, but to the story itself. The climax of Alastair Finch's obsession came one winter night in 1928. A campus security guard making his rounds saw that the light in Finch's office was on. He heard a strange, rhythmic sound from within, a soft, repetitive thudding. When he tried the door, he found it was locked from the inside. Peering through the frosted glass, he could make out a dark shape, but little else. Concerned, he called for assistance. When they finally forced the door open, they were met with a scene of quiet, academic horror. Alastair Finch was dead, slumped in his chair. He had not been attacked. There was no sign of a struggle. The coroner's report would later list the cause of death as a massive, inexplicable heart failure. But that was not the most disturbing detail. On his desk, his unfinished manuscript on the Wythe County Massacre was laid out neatly. And arranged in a perfect semicircle around it were 12 of his oldest, most valuable books, pulled from his shelves to form a silent, miniature jury. And on his neck, barely visible, was a thin, dark line, a mark that resembled a razor-sharp cut, a horrifying, macabre smile. The thudding sound the guard had heard was Finch's own head, which had been rhythmically tapping against his desk in his final, terrifying moments. The hollow judge had crossed state lines to silence the man who threatened to reveal its existence. The university, horrified and fearing a scandal, acted swiftly and with the same cold efficiency as the Virginian government in 1796. Alastair Finch's death was officially ruled as being from natural causes, exacerbated by overwork and stress. His office was quietly cleared out, his research impounded by the university administration. His manuscript, the only comprehensive account of the Courthouse Massacre, was locked away in the university's deepest, most inaccessible archive, labeled as delusional writings of a disturbed academic. It was banned from publication, its contents deemed too inflammatory and insane. The small, blood-stained piece of the courthouse door vanished, never to be seen again. The story of the massacre was erased for a second time, buried under layers of academic bureaucracy and institutional fear. The cover-up was complete. The few colleagues who knew the truth about Finch's research were strongly encouraged to forget what they had seen and heard. The silence was restored. The entity that dwelled in the Whispering Hollow was once again safe in its obscurity, its dark history protected by the very institutions of reason and knowledge that it sought to subvert. The story had proven itself to be a curse upon any who tried to tell it. What then was the true nature of the land at the heart of this horrifying tale? The Whispering Hollow. The name itself is a whisper of its dark power. Modern geological surveys of the region have revealed something peculiar about that specific tract of land. It is riddled with a vast, uncharted network of limestone caves, one of the densest concentrations in North America. These deep, subterranean caverns create strange acoustic effects. Wind blowing through the hidden fissures and tunnels can create sounds that mimic human whispers, moans, or even the striking of a gavel. Early settlers, with their superstitious worldviews, could easily have interpreted these natural sounds as the voice of a supernatural entity dwelling beneath the earth. The hollow judge may not have been an entirely folkloric invention, but their interpretation of a real, unsettling, and ever-present auditory phenomenon. This geological feature could also explain the unnatural silence reported by so many. The same cave systems that create sound can also absorb it, creating pockets of dead air where the normal sounds of the forest seem to vanish completely. The curse of Wythe County, it seems, is written into the very rock and soil of the land itself. But this rational geological explanation, while comforting, fails to account for the full scope of the horror. It does not explain the impossibly locked room, the precision of the slaughter, or the recurring, specific details of the hauntings that span centuries. There is another, far more disturbing theory. It ties back to the reclusive German sect and the forbidden books found in Silas Cole's cabin. Researchers of obscure European history have noted similarities between the Wythe County sigils and those associated with a pre-Christian Germanic cult that was brutally suppressed during the Middle Ages. This cult was said to worship an entity of judgment, an arbiter of disputes that existed in the roots of the world. Their rituals were notoriously bloody, often involving the mimicry of legal or royal courts, with human sacrifices acting as the silent courtiers or silent jury. The theory suggests that a small, fanatical remnant of this cult fled persecution in Europe and brought their beliefs with them to the New World. They found the geologically strange Whispering Hollow and believed they had found a place where their entity was already present, a place of immense natural power that they could harness. The Massacre of 1796 was not an isolated act of a lone fanatic like Elias Vance. It was the culmination of a multi-generational plan. This theory posits a horrifying truth. The community in Wythe County was never just a simple settlement of farmers and merchants. It harbored a hidden, secret society, a continuation of the ancient European cult. Elias Vance was not an outsider who brought a foreign evil with him. He was a homegrown product, a young acolyte chosen to perform a long-awaited ceremony. Silas Cole, with his ancestral books, was likely a descendant of a dissenting branch of the cult, one that had come to fear the entity their ancestors had worshipped. His desperate attempt to stop the land dispute was an attempt to prevent the main sect from gaining control of the Hollow, the sacred center of their power. The massacre in this light becomes even more terrifying. It was not just a summoning, it was a coup. The cult used the courthouse, the symbol of the new American law, to perform a ritual that would cement their entity's power in the region and eliminate the dissenting bloodline of Silas Cole in the process. Jedediah Parris was simply a useful idiot, his greed a perfect tool to set their plan in motion. The 22 victims were a blood sacrifice to consecrate the land for a new, dark master. The most macabre element of this theory concerns the cover-up itself. If a secret society was deeply embedded within the community, they would have had the means and the motive to ensure the truth was never revealed. Judge Spencer Roane was a man of logic, but he was also a pragmatist. Is it possible that the cult, in the aftermath of the ritual, revealed themselves to him? Not with threats, but with a chilling proposition. They could have presented him with the full, unbelievable truth, knowing he could never make it public. They could have offered to help him restore order, to ensure such an event never happened again, in exchange for his silence and his assistance in erasing the official record. This would explain the chilling efficiency of the cover-up. It wasn't just a government action. It was a conspiracy between the forces of law and the forces of a dark, ancient faith, both sides working together to bury a truth too terrible for the world to know. Judge Roane may have spent the rest of his life as an unwilling guardian of a horrifying secret, a man of the law forced into a pact with a lawless, ancient power to maintain a fragile peace. His subsequent career, though distinguished, was marked by a noted melancholy and a deep, private aversion to ever returning to Wythe County. This theory of a hidden cult reframes the entire history of the region. The Wythe County stalemate, the recurring hung juries, were they the lingering effects of a supernatural curse, or the deliberate, ongoing intervention of a secret society? Could descendants of the cult have systematically placed their members on juries over the decades, ensuring that verdicts never went against their interests, sowing chaos and undermining faith in the legal system their entity despised? The hauntings, The sightings of the silent jury, were they ghosts? Or were they members of the cult, cloaked and disguised, performing rituals in the woods to maintain their power and intimidate outsiders? It's a terrifying thought, that the history of a place could be secretly steered by a hidden hand, its folklore deliberately manufactured to mask a very real and present human conspiracy. The curse of the Hollow Judge becomes something far more insidious, not a ghost story, but the long, unbroken shadow of a cabal that has never relinquished its control over the hills and hollows of Wythe County. The horror is not that monsters are real, but that the most monstrous acts are committed by men, hidden in plain sight. Today, the town of Evansham is now Wytheville. It's a quiet town nestled by the Blue Ridge Mountains. The Whispering Hollow is now part of a state forest, a place for hiking and camping. The original site of the 1796 courthouse is believed to be under a modern parking lot behind a pharmacy. There is no plaque, no memorial, no acknowledgement of the horror that transpired there. The erasure has been almost perfect. To the outside world, the story is completely unknown. But within the town, a subtle legacy remains. The oldest families still avoid the Whispering Hollow. They still tell their children to be home before dark. And sometimes in legal circles within the county, you can still hear the faint, joking reference to the Wythe County stalemate when a jury struggles to reach a decision. The story, despite being banned, has survived. It has seeped into the bones of the place, a chilling, unspoken truth that everyone feels but no one names. It is a cold case that can never be closed, a mystery that is both a historical event and an active, breathing presence. The blood that was spilled in 1796 did more than just stain the floorboards of a log courthouse. It created a permanent wound on the landscape, a place where the past is never truly dead. There is one final, disturbing thread to this story. In 1998, during a renovation of the current Wythe County Courthouse, the third one built since the massacre, construction workers made a strange discovery. Sealed within a wall cavity behind the judge's bench, they found a small, corroded iron box. It was not a time capsule. Inside, resting on a bed of faded velvet, was a single object, a gavel, but it was not made of wood. It was carved from a single piece of dark, polished stone that was cold to the touch, even on a hot summer day. There was no record of who had placed it there or why, but the most unsettling feature was the base of the gavel's head. Etched into the stone with unnerving precision was a familiar symbol, a spiral of intersecting lines, the same sigil found under Silas Cole's table, in Elias Vance's journal, and on the crude drawing in the court ledger from 1796. The artifact was quietly handed over to a local historical society, where it sits today in a dusty, mislabeled display case, its horrifying significance completely unrecognized. But its presence inside the walls of the modern courthouse serves as a chilling, silent reminder. It suggests that the cult and its hollow judge have never been far from the seat of justice in Wythe County. They are not a memory of the past. They are part of the foundation. So what is the final truth of the Wythe County Courthouse Massacre? Was it the work of a single, crazed fanatic, the bloody outcome of a pact with a supernatural entity from beyond the veil? Or was it the masterstroke of a multi-generational secret society, a conspiracy so deep its tendrils are still woven into the fabric of the community today? The very nature of the cover-up ensures that we can never know for certain. The evidence was systematically destroyed, the witnesses silenced, and the story itself banned and relegated to the status of a ghost story. This ambiguity is, perhaps, the most chilling part of the entire affair. It leaves us adrift in a sea of horrifying possibilities. The story exists in a permanent twilight between history and folklore, between a cold case and a curse. It demonstrates how easily the truth can be consumed by darkness, and how an event so violent and profound can be wiped from the pages of history, leaving behind only whispers, nightmares, and a deep, unshakable sense of dread in the place where it happened. The massacre they tried to erase has, in its own way, achieved a kind of immortality. It has become a permanent, unspoken question mark, a void in the historical record that is more terrifying than any documented fact could ever be. The tale serves as a disturbing testament to the darkness that lurked in the foundations of the early American Republic. Behind the enlightened ideals of liberty and justice, older, more primal forces were at play. The frontier was not just a line on a map. It was a psychological space where the certainties of civilization crumbled, and the ancient fears of humanity could reassert themselves with terrifying force. The courthouse in Evancham was meant to be a symbol of the New World's order, but it became a stage for a ritual as old as the dark forests that surrounded it. The story forces us to confront the idea that our history is not as neat and rational as we believe it to be. It suggests there are hidden chapters, excised paragraphs, and entire volumes of forbidden lore that have been deliberately kept from us. Events where the line between murder and sacrifice, between law and dark magic, became terrifyingly blurred. These are the stories that are banned not just to prevent panic, but to protect our fragile understanding of the world. Because to admit that an entity like the Hollow Judge could hold court in a house of law is to admit that the foundations of our society are built over something ancient and utterly indifferent to our existence. In the end, we are left where Judge Spencer Roane was in 1796, standing before a horrifying and inexplicable event, armed only with reason against a mystery that seems to defy it at every turn. We can analyze the geological data, we can theorize about secret societies, and we can dismiss the supernatural elements as the product of fear and superstition. But we cannot escape the core, chilling facts of the case. 22 people died in a room locked and barred from the inside, a room from which no killer ever escaped. They were discovered in a state of grotesque, ritualistic peace, their bodies marked with the signature of an impossible crime. An event of such profound strangeness and horror occurred that the authorities of a fledgling nation took extraordinary measures to pretend it never happened at all. They chose to create a hole in their own history rather than confront the macabre truth of what took place in that courthouse. The silence they imposed is, in many ways, more damning than any confession. It is an admission of fear, a silent acknowledgement that they encountered something so profoundly disturbing that the only sane response was to bury it and pray that it would never rise again. The parking lot in modern-day Wytheville is a quiet, unremarkable place. Cars come and go. People shop at the pharmacy, oblivious to the fact that they are walking on ground that was once saturated with the blood of an unholy sacrifice. But if you stand there on a quiet autumn evening, as the mist begins to roll down from the mountains, you might still feel it. A certain coldness in the air, a profound and unnatural silence that seems to absorb all sound. It is the lingering echo of a forbidden history, the ghost of a story that refuses to be completely erased. The Hollow Judge may no longer hold court, and the silent jury may have been dismissed, but the dread remains. It serves as a final, chilling reminder that some cold cases are cold for a reason. Some mysteries are left unsolved because the truth is more terrifying than the crime itself. And some doors, once opened, can never truly be closed again. They can only be walled off, hidden behind a facade of normalcy, waiting in the darkness for someone to once again whisper their name.